We booked the cabin almost a year before the trip. A small Airbnb in the Iceland countryside, far from towns, far from traffic, chosen for one reason: northern lights. The listing showed a single dark house standing alone in a wide white valley with mountains behind it. No nearby buildings, no streetlights, no power lines. The photos looked quiet in a way that felt rare. We arrived in late January. The drive from the airport took nearly 4 hours. After the last village, the road narrowed and the landscape opened into flat snowfields broken by low hills and frozen streams. The sky stayed pale all day. The sun never climbed high, just hovered and slid sideways before fading. The house stood at the end of a gravel track buried under packed snow. Metal roof, dark wood walls, one row of windows facing the valley. A separate trash container sat near the road, about 30 meters away, a large plastic bin weighted with rocks on the lid to keep it from blowing over. Inside, the place felt solid and warm. Heated floors, thick insulation, heavy doors. The kind of house built for wind. The roof was corrugated metal. The host had written that in the description, common in rural areas because snow slides off easily. The first 2 nights were quiet. The wind came and went, sometimes loud enough to hum along the roof, sometimes completely still. We spent evenings watching the sky through the big window, lights off, waiting. On the second night, we saw faint green bands moving low on the horizon. It lasted 10 minutes, then clouds rolled in. The forecast for the third night showed a storm. Strong wind, heavy snow. We decided to stay in, cook, and hope the weather cleared later. By evening, the wind had already picked up. It came across the valley without anything to break it. The house creaked at times, not from weakness but from pressure. The metal roof made sharp ticking sounds as the temperature dropped and the panels tightened. Around midnight, the storm reached full strength. Snow moved sideways past the windows. The wind produced a steady roar, like distant surf. The house held steady, but the sound level stayed high enough that we spoke louder than normal without realizing it. We went to bed anyway. The bedroom sat under the roof slope. You could hear the weather more clearly there. At first, the noises were what I expected. Wind pushing, loose snow sliding, the occasional sharp tap of ice or debris. Then, sometime later, I woke to a different sound. Heavy contact. Not impact, not something blown across. Wait. A slow thud, then another, spaced apart. Each one pressed through the ceiling structure rather than striking it. The sound carried a low vibration through the bed frame. I stayed still and listened. The movement continued across the roof. Not running, not scrambling. Slow steps, each one deliberate. The spacing suggested something large, or something moving carefully. Then the sound changed. A dragging noise, metal against something rough. The corrugated panels amplified it into a long scraping slide. I thought of ice first, a slab shifting under wind pressure. But the steps came again after the scrape. 2 more heavy placements, then another drag. The ceiling above us trembled slightly with each contact. The wind outside did not pause. Snow kept hitting the windows in bursts. That made it harder to isolate the roof sounds, but the pattern stood out because it had rhythm. The movement crossed the center of the roof, stopped for several seconds, then resumed toward the opposite edge. Near the end, the weight seemed to shift suddenly. A sliding rush of metal noise ran downward toward the eaves. Then silence. I waited for more, but nothing followed except wind. I slept lightly after that. Once or twice I thought I heard distant movement again, but the storm noise swallowed everything. Morning came gray and still. The wind had dropped. Snow lay smooth across the valley, untouched except for the narrow track leading to the road. The roof looked normal from the ground. Snow had blown off most of the metal panels, leaving thin streaks caught in the ridges. I walked around the house. On the side facing the road, I noticed marks along the roof edge. Several gouges ran across the metal lip where the panels extended past the wall. The paint had been scratched down to bare metal. The marks were not random scuffs. They formed parallel lines, spaced unevenly, each about the width of a finger. Below them, the gutter held clumps of dark hair caught in the ice. Coarse, thick strands, several centimeters long. I kept walking. The trash container near the road had been tipped onto its side. The rocks that weighed down the lid lay scattered. The lid itself had been forced partly open. The container had slid several meters through the snow, leaving a wide drag path. There were tracks around it. At first I thought they were wind patterns, but looking closer I saw impressions. Footprints repeating, deep enough to show shape. Large for a fox. larger than any dog I had seen in person. The stride length was long, the path steady, circling the container several times before leading toward the house. The same track line approached the wall, disappeared where snow had drifted, then reappeared on the far side, heading back toward the open valley. I took photos of everything and sent them to the host through the Airbnb app. The reply came an hour later. Arctic foxes sometimes climb onto roofs during storms. When snow piles high along the walls, they use the drift as a ramp. They seek higher ground to avoid deep powder and strong wind. The metal surface also sheds snow, giving them a firmer place to move. That explained the hair and the trash. Foxes raid containers often. The host said winter storms sometimes push them closer to houses. But the prints around the bin did not match the size of a fox. I measured one using my boot. The length came close to the width of my palm. I sent another photo, this time with scale. The host responded again. In harsh winters, Arctic foxes sometimes travel with larger animals. Reindeer herds move through the valley. Foxes follow them for scraps and shelter. A reindeer could have reached the roof using a deep drift against the wall. That sounded unlikely until I walked back to the house and looked carefully at the snow buildup. On the north side, wind had piled snow nearly to the lower edge of the roof. The drift formed a hard slope, packed by repeated gusts. An animal stepping onto it would only need another meter to reach the metal. The gouges along the edge matched the width of a hoof when I compared the spacing. Two larger marks paired together, followed by a gap, then another pair. The dragging sound during the night made sense then. Hooves sliding on metal, struggling for grip. The heavy steps, the ceiling vibration, the sudden slide toward the edge. Later that afternoon, a line of distant shapes moved along the far side of the valley. A small group of reindeer, dark against the snow, heading slowly toward higher ground. That night we stayed awake during the storm. Around 2 a.m., the same pattern returned. Weight on the drift outside, then a heavy body climbing onto the roof. The steps were careful and slow, hooves slipping and correcting. Snow slid down the metal in sheets. At one point the animal paused directly above the bedroom. The ceiling creaked under the load. Then came the familiar sliding rush as it lost footing and descended toward the edge. In the morning, new tracks confirmed it. Large hoof prints led from the valley to the drift, then away again. The fox explanation had not been wrong. Tufts of dark hair in the gutter came from one that had climbed earlier in the season. But the shaking, the weight, the dragging metal sound had come from something much heavier. For the rest of the trip, I checked the drift each evening. If the wind began building it too high, I broke the slope with a shovel so nothing could use it as a ramp. On our last night, the sky finally cleared. Green light moved across the valley in slow waves while the roof stayed quiet above us. In July of 2021, I moved into a furnished apartment on the north side of San Antonio. The lease on my old place had ended the same week my divorce papers were finalized. I needed somewhere temporary while I figured out where to go next. Hotels were too expensive for more than a few days. A short-term rental made more sense. The listing showed a clean 2-bedroom unit in an older 3-story building. Beige walls, simple furniture, nothing personal. The second bedroom was staged as an office with a desk and a small bed. I only needed one room, but the monthly price was lower than most one-bedroom options. That was enough for me. The building sat behind a strip of small businesses and backed up to an alley. Parking was in a gravel lot behind a locked gate. The front entrance required a keypad code. The host handled everything through messages and left a key inside a lockbox by the door. The first week felt quiet in a way that helped. I worked long hours, came back, ate something simple, and went to sleep. I kept the second bedroom closed from the first day. I did not need the space, and the empty room made the apartment feel larger than I wanted. I told myself I would use it later for storage, but I never did. The building had the sounds older places carry. Footsteps from above, water moving through pipes, doors closing down the hall. None of it bothered me. About 7 days in, I came home after work and noticed the spare bedroom door was open a few inches. I stopped in the hallway and looked at it for a while. I knew I had closed it that morning. I always checked doors and lights before leaving. It was a habit from years of commuting. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air felt different. Cooler, but not from the vent. There was a faint smell that did not belong to the apartment. Not strong, just something stale and sour, like fabric that had been worn for days. The room looked the same. The desk was empty. The bed was made tight with a thin comforter. The blinds were halfway down, the way I had left them. The window was unlocked. I remembered locking every window on my first day. I walked over and tested the latch twice. It slid too easily. I locked it again and closed the blinds fully. That night I made a note on my phone to ask the host about the windows. I never sent the message. 2 days later the door was open again when I got home. This time it was wider, maybe 6 inches. The smell was stronger. The air felt used, like someone had been breathing in the room. I checked the window first. The latch was unlocked again. That was the point where I walked through the apartment and checked every other window and door. Nothing else was open. The front door showed no sign of forced entry. The lock worked fine. I locked the spare room window, closed the blinds, and shut the door hard enough to hear the latch click. That night I woke up at 1:15 a.m. to a cough. It came from the other side of the hallway. I sat up and listened. The apartment was quiet again. No footsteps. No movement. I waited long enough for my eyes to adjust to the dark and then got out of bed. The spare bedroom door was closed. I opened it and turned on the light. The room was empty. The bed was still made. The desk was still clear. The air smelled the same as before, faint but wrong. I checked the window. Locked. I pushed on it from the inside to make sure it held. I closed the door and slept with the bedroom light on. The next morning I searched the building online. It had been renovated about 10 years earlier. The original structure dated back to the 1960s. No reports of break-ins, nothing unusual. I finally messaged the host about the window latch being loose. He replied that he would send maintenance at some point that week. Maintenance never came. Over the next few days the spare room door stayed closed, but the smell spread into the hallway. I began keeping the apartment cooler, thinking maybe the humidity was causing it. The building had an external metal fire escape that ran along the back wall. I could see it from the parking lot, but I never paid attention to which windows connected to it. On a Thursday evening I left work early because the power had gone out at the office. I reached the apartment around 4:30 p.m., earlier than my normal return. As I walked through the back lot, I noticed movement on the fire escape. A man was halfway through the spare bedroom window. He was thin, wearing a gray shirt and dark pants, one leg already outside on the metal platform. A backpack hung from one shoulder. He froze when he saw me. For a moment neither of us moved. Then he dropped onto the fire escape and went down the stairs fast, metal clanging under his weight. He cut through the alley and disappeared between 2 buildings. I went upstairs and unlocked my door with shaking hands. The spare bedroom window was open. The blinds were pushed aside. The smell hit me as soon as I stepped into the hallway. The bed was no longer tight. The comforter was wrinkled and pulled toward the edge. There were faint dirt marks on the carpet near the window. The desk drawer was open. Inside the closet I found a plastic grocery bag with empty food wrappers, a water bottle, and a small flashlight. He had been using the room during the day. I checked the rest of the apartment. Nothing appeared stolen. My bedroom had not been touched. My laptop and work bag were where I left them. The fire escape connected directly to that window. From the alley, someone could climb up without being seen from the street. The window latch was loose enough to open from the outside with pressure. The unlocked window. The smell. The cough. He had been inside the apartment while I was at work, possibly while I slept. I called the police and waited outside in the hallway until they arrived. They photographed the room, collected the bag, and checked the fire escape for signs of use. One officer said the setup was common in older buildings, especially if exterior access was not monitored. The host arrived later that evening, surprised and defensive. The listing had never mentioned the fire escape connection. He claimed tenants were expected to keep all windows secured. The window frame was warped. The latch barely held. Anyone who knew the building could open it. I did not stay there that night. The next day I moved into a hotel and canceled the remaining weeks. The platform issued a partial refund after the police report was submitted. A week later the host sent a message saying the window had been repaired and security cameras were being installed near the alley. I never went back. For months afterward, I woke up at night listening for sounds that did not belong. In every place I lived after that, I checked windows first, then closets, then any room I did not plan to use. I learned later that the police had identified a transient man who had been sleeping in several buildings along that alley. He used fire escapes and maintenance gaps to move between units during the day. He avoided places that looked occupied and left before evening when possible. The spare bedroom had stayed closed. The lights were always off. From outside, it looked empty. I had been living alone in that apartment. He had been living there too. I booked the cabin in late September of 2015. I had been living in a small apartment in Toronto, trying to finish a collection of short stories I had promised a publisher. The city noise was constant. Sirens, buses, footsteps in the hallway outside my unit. I wanted silence. I searched for places in northern Ontario and found a listing that described complete isolation. The photos showed a small wooden structure set in a clearing surrounded by tall pines and bare rock. The description said no neighbors for miles. It said perfect for writers. That was enough for me. The drive north took most of a day. Highway turned to two-lane road, then to gravel. Cell service faded an hour before I reached the property. The final stretch was a narrow path cut through dense forest. Fallen leaves covered the ground in a thick orange layer. The air smelled like cold earth and pine sap. It was early October. The trees were almost bare. The sky had that pale gray color that comes before winter. The cabin looked exactly like the photos. One story, dark brown wood siding, small porch with 2 plastic chairs. A metal chimney pipe rose from the roof. There was no other structure in sight. No power lines. No mailbox. Just trees in every direction. The silence felt heavy. Even the wind seemed muted. The host had sent instructions for a lockbox attached to the porch railing. The key was inside. I unlocked the door and stepped into a single room that served as kitchen and living area. A small bedroom was at the back, along with a bathroom that used a composting toilet. There was a propane fridge, a 2-burner stove, and a wood stove for heat. Everything looked clean, sparse but organized. I carried my bags in and locked the door behind me. That first evening passed without incident. I chopped some firewood from a pile beside the cabin and stacked it near the stove. I cooked pasta on the propane burner and ate at the small wooden table by the window. Outside, darkness settled quickly. There were no distant lights. No traffic. The forest became a solid black wall. I felt satisfied with my decision. The quiet was absolute. I went to bed around midnight. The bedroom window faced the back of the property. I could see only the faint outline of trees against the sky. I locked the front door and the back door and slid the deadbolt into place. I checked them twice. It was a habit I had developed in the city. I woke up to a sound at 2 a.m. At first I thought it was a dream. Then I heard it again. A slow crunching noise, steady and deliberate. Gravel shifting under weight. The sound came from the front of the cabin. I held my breath and listened. The steps were not quick. They moved along the length of the porch, then stopped. My heart started to pound. I sat up in bed and waited. The cabin walls were thin. I could hear each movement outside clearly. After a few seconds, the steps resumed, moving off the porch and back onto the gravel path. They faded into the trees. I did not get out of bed. I told myself it was an animal. A deer could make similar sounds. A bear would be heavier, but it was possible. The area was remote. Wildlife was expected. I stayed awake for another hour listening. Nothing else happened. Eventually I slept. Morning light made everything seem ordinary. I made coffee and opened the front door. The air was cold and sharp. That was when I noticed the cigarette butts. 3 of them, fresh, lying near the edge of the porch. They were not wet from dew. The filters were clean, not faded from exposure. I did not smoke. They had not been there the day before. I scanned the ground. Near the back door, pressed into the damp soil, was a boot print. The tread was clear. It was larger than my shoe size. The pattern looked recent. The edges were still sharp. I tried to reason through it. Maybe the previous guest had smoked outside before leaving. Maybe the cleaning had been rushed. The host had mentioned high demand during fall season. I convinced myself it was nothing more than that. I did not want to leave after one night. I had driven too far. The second day was quiet. I walked a short trail that circled the clearing. There were no other cabins. No vehicles. No footprints except mine. I wrote for hours at the table, the forest visible through the window. The silence returned, deep and constant. By evening, my tension had eased. I secured the doors again before bed. I placed a heavy cast iron pan on the floor near the front entrance, close enough that it would fall if the door moved inward. It was a simple alarm. I kept a flashlight beside my pillow. At 2 a.m. the sound came back. Gravel shifting under slow steps. This time I did not question what I was hearing. It was measured and controlled. The steps moved onto the porch. The boards creaked under weight. The sound stopped directly in front of the door. The handle rattled once. A quick, testing movement. The pan did not fall. The deadbolt held firm. I stayed frozen in bed, every muscle tight. I waited for another attempt. None came. After a few seconds, the steps retreated across the porch and back into the dark. I did not sleep at all. I watched the faint outline of the window until dawn. When light finally came, I moved through the cabin slowly, checking each corner. Nothing inside had changed. Outside, I found new cigarette butts near the same spot. The boot print by the back door was deeper, as if someone had stood there longer. I walked the perimeter of the cabin and noticed a gap between the ground and the base of the structure. The cabin was raised slightly on concrete blocks. The space underneath was shadowed. I crouched down and shined my flashlight inside. There was a sleeping bag laid out on a plastic sheet. Next to it were empty food cans, a half-full bottle of water, and a small backpack. A pair of worn gloves rested on top of the pack. The space was large enough for a person to crawl in and lie flat. Someone had been staying under the cabin. I stepped back and felt a wave of nausea. The steps at night were not random. They were not animals. The person had likely been returning to the space beneath the floor after checking the door. I went inside and locked both doors. I packed my belongings into my car within minutes. Before leaving, I took photos of the items under the cabin and the cigarette butts. Once I reached a spot with cell service, I called the host and sent the images. Later that day, the host admitted the property had problems with a former tenant who had rented the land years earlier and built a small shed nearby that had since been removed. The lease had ended badly. He had refused to leave the area for months and had been seen camping in the woods around the property. The host believed he had eventually moved on. There had been no reports in over a year. The host arranged for local authorities to check the cabin. They found the space under it empty. The sleeping bag and backpack were gone. Tire tracks were discovered along a logging road a few hundred meters away, suggesting someone had left quickly. The explanation was direct. A former tenant had been using the underside of the cabin as shelter, returning at night, possibly unaware that a new guest was inside until the first evening. Once he realized the place was occupied, he had tested the door. When I remained inside and did not leave after the second night, he removed his belongings and disappeared. I never returned to retrieve the last few items I had left behind. The host mailed them to me weeks later. I finished my writing at home, surrounded by city noise that no longer bothered me. The memory of slow steps on gravel stayed with me. It was not the isolation that frightened me. It was the fact that the isolation had never been real. In September 2018, I rented a small house in rural Colorado with 2 friends for a long weekend of hiking. We had planned the trip for months. We wanted cool air, empty trails, and a break from city noise. The listing showed a simple 1-story cabin set at the edge of open land, with a line of dark forest behind it. The nearest town was 20 minutes away by car. The photos made it look quiet and isolated, which was the point. We arrived in the late afternoon. The drive-in took us along a narrow dirt road lined with dry grass and scattered pine. The air smelled sharp and clean. The house sat alone at the edge of a clearing. Behind it, the ground sloped gently up into dense trees. Tall ponderosa pines stood close together, their trunks straight and reddish-brown. The forest looked thick enough to block most light once the sun went down. The house itself was older than I expected. The siding was rough wood, sun-faded and cracked in places. There was a small porch with 2 plastic chairs and a metal trash bin near the steps. The windows were wide and faced the clearing. The back wall faced the treeline. No fence separated the yard from the woods. Inside, the place was simple but clean. 3 small bedrooms, a living room with a worn couch, a kitchen with basic appliances. The floor creaked in certain spots. It felt like a hunting cabin someone had fixed up just enough to rent out. We spent the evening cooking pasta and planning the next day's hike. The sun dropped quickly behind the trees. Once it was dark, it felt very dark. No streetlights, no passing cars. The sky was clear and filled with stars. Around 10:30, We stepped outside to look at the sky. The forest behind the house looked like a solid black wall. No wind moved through it. The air had turned cold enough that our breath showed. Around 11, after we had gone inside and shut off most of the lights, we heard something outside. At first it was just a dull shift in sound, like weight moving through dry grass. We paused and listened. The noise came again. Slow steps. Heavy. Not quick like a deer. Not light like a dog. The sound came from behind the house, near the treeline. It did not rush or crash. It moved with steady pressure, brushing against something. We turned off the living room light and stood near the window. Our eyes adjusted. At the edge of the clearing, just where the trees began, there was a darker shape against the dark background. It stood upright. It was tall, taller than any of us. The outline was not sharp, but it was clear enough to see the vertical shape and a broader top. It did not sway. It did not bend down. It stayed in one place, facing the house. One of us grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and shined it toward the treeline. The beam cut across the clearing and hit the shape. The light reflected faintly off something dark and solid. The figure did not move when the beam touched it. It stayed upright, motionless. I felt a cold pressure in my chest. My mind tried to make sense of the size and posture. It did not look like a deer on hind legs because it held the position too long. It did not look like a person either. The proportions were wrong, thicker through the middle. We kept the light on it for several seconds. Then the beam shifted slightly, and in that brief movement, the shape was gone. No running sound followed. No crash through brush. Just empty space at the treeline. We stood there for a long time, listening. Nothing else moved. Eventually we locked the doors and checked the windows. The house suddenly felt thin. Every creak sounded louder. We left a porch light on and went to bed, though none of us slept well. In the morning, the clearing looked normal at first glance. The sun lit the grass and the trees looked harmless. Then we noticed the ground near the back wall of the house. In the soft dirt beneath the siding were deep impressions. They were not boot prints. They were wide and rounded, with faint claw marks at the front. The soil had been pressed down with real weight. Near the porch, the metal trash bin had been knocked over. The lid lay several feet away. A torn garbage bag was scattered across the yard. Food wrappers and scraps were spread in a rough circle, as if something had stood there and sorted through it. Along the wooden siding on the back wall were long scratch marks. They started about 7 feet off the ground and ran downward at an angle. The wood was gouged deep enough to expose fresh pale layers beneath the weathered surface. The marks were spaced in a way that suggested a large paw dragging down with force. Seeing those details in daylight made the shape from the night before more real. The height of the scratches matched the height of what we had seen. Whatever stood there had leaned against the house. We cleaned up the trash and set the bin inside the garage. We told ourselves it was likely a bear. Colorado has plenty of them. Still, the way it stood upright and did not move under the flashlight felt deliberate. It had not acted startled. We went on our planned hike that day. The trailhead was about 15 minutes away. The forest there felt open and safe compared to the wall of trees behind the house. We saw signs posted about wildlife, including black bears active in the area. We carried bear spray, but did not see anything unusual during the hike. That night we were more alert. We locked everything early and kept the lights off inside so we could see outside if needed. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a low sound. It took a moment to place it. It was breathing, slow and heavy, close to the wall. The sound moved along the side of the house. I could hear the faint scrape of something brushing wood, then a soft thud, like weight pressing against it. The house creaked slightly in response. The breathing passed my window and continued toward the front. I lay still, listening to the path it took. It circled the structure, step by step. The grass outside rustled under each shift of weight. At one point it stopped directly beneath the window. I could hear air moving in and out through a large chest. It did not try to break in. It did not claw at the door. It simply moved around us, slow and steady, as if testing the space. After what felt like an hour, but was likely minutes, the sound drifted back toward the trees. No sudden noise marked its departure. The clearing went silent again. We did not wait for another night. At first light, we packed the car. The yard showed fresh tracks overlapping the ones from before. The dirt near the siding had been disturbed again. The scratch marks were deeper. On the drive out, we stopped at a ranger station near the highway. We described the house location and what we had seen. The ranger on duty listened and nodded. There had been multiple reports that summer of a large black bear approaching cabins at night. It had grown used to human trash. It had started standing upright against walls, possibly to sniff through windows or test surfaces. Bears can reach impressive height when they stand on hind legs, especially large males at the end of summer when they are heavy from feeding. The deep impressions, the scattered garbage, the 7-foot scratches, all matched that behavior. The ranger explained that once a bear associates cabins with food, it can lose its natural caution. It may circle structures and investigate without fear of light or noise. Driving away, the shape in the treeline made sense in a way that did not comfort me. It had not been a person or anything unknown. It had been an animal strong enough to tear siding and heavy enough to leave deep marks in packed earth. It had stood upright and looked toward the house, because that is what bears do when they want a better sense of what is in front of them. The house at the forest edge had not been protected by distance or silence. It had simply been in the path of something hungry and bold. We had chosen it for isolation. That isolation had already belonged to something else. I took the Airbnb because it was close to the hospital and cheaper than any extended stay hotel. The listing said private lower unit, separate entrance, full privacy. The photos showed a clean space with a small kitchenette, a couch, and a bedroom area at the back. It looked temporary but comfortable. I was scheduled for 3 weeks of night shifts, 12 hours each, and I needed somewhere quiet where I could sleep during the day. The house sat in a quiet Milwaukee neighborhood with narrow streets and old brick homes. Snow was packed along the sidewalks, gray from weeks of traffic. The driveway ran along the side of the house to a detached garage. The basement entrance was at the back, down a short set of concrete steps with a metal railing and a motion light overhead. The host met me outside when I arrived. His name was Robert. Mid-50s, clean jacket, careful smile. He walked me through the space, pointed out the thermostat, the extra blankets, the laundry area behind a folding door. He asked where I worked and what hours I would be keeping. I assumed he was making conversation or trying to be helpful. I told him I would mostly be gone at night and sleeping during the day. The basement looked finished, but still felt like a basement. The ceilings were low. The windows were small and set high in the walls. The air held a faint smell of old carpet and dry dust. The furniture was simple and older than the photos suggested, but everything was clean. At the far end of the main room, there was a solid door with a deadbolt and a handle lock. Robert explained that the door led to the upstairs portion of the house and that it would stay locked from both sides. He said it was only there because the space had once been part of the main home. After he left, I checked the door myself. I turned the deadbolt and the handle lock. Both seemed secure. I pushed against it. It did not move. The first few nights passed without anything unusual. My routine settled quickly. I left around 6 in the evening, worked through the night, and came back between 7 and 8 in the morning. I slept with a white noise app running because daytime sounds carried easily through the ceiling. By the 4th day, small details started to bother me. One afternoon, I woke up and noticed the light above the kitchenette was on. I never used that light. I preferred the lamp near the couch because it was softer. I assumed I had left it on while half asleep before work. That same evening, my shampoo bottle was turned so the label faced the wall. I remembered placing it facing outward when I unpacked. It seemed like a strange thing to notice, and I told myself I was overthinking it. Night shifts distort your sense of time and memory. I had worked them before and knew how easily your mind could misplace details. 2 days later, I came home and saw the basement door at the end of the room standing slightly open. Not wide, just enough to see a thin strip of darkness between the frame and the door. I was sure I had locked it that morning. I closed it, locked both locks again, and pressed my weight against it. It held. I checked it again before leaving for work that night. The next morning, it was closed and locked. For a while, nothing happened. I kept noticing small changes. The couch pillow moved from one end to the other. The kitchen trash lid left half open. The thermostat adjusted by a few degrees. Each thing was minor and explainable. I told myself I was tired. I started double-checking everything before leaving. On the 6th night, my shift ended early because the unit census dropped. I left the hospital around 3 in the morning and drove back through empty streets. The temperature had dropped below 0. The snow squeaked under my shoes as I walked down the steps to the basement door. Inside, the space felt colder than usual. The air had that still quality of a place that had been closed for hours. I locked the exterior door behind me and turned toward the main room. That was when I heard movement above me. Slow footsteps crossed the ceiling from one side of the house to the other, then back again. The pacing was steady and deliberate. It did not sound like someone walking to the kitchen or bathroom. It sounded like someone moving back and forth. I stood still, listening. The pacing stopped. A few seconds passed. Then I heard the faint click of the door handle at the end of the basement. I did not move. The handle turned slowly, metal scraping softly against the latch. It rotated halfway and stopped. The door did not open. The handle returned to its original position. I stayed where I was for a long time, standing near the entrance with my coat still on. I did not turn on any lights. I did not make any sound. Eventually, I walked to the bedroom and locked the exterior door again, even though it was already locked. I did not sleep. The next morning, after the sun came up, I went to the basement door and examined the locks. The deadbolt turned easily. The handle lock also turned. When I pushed the door, it opened a few inches even with the deadbolt engaged. The strike plate was worn down, and the deadbolt did not extend far enough into the frame to hold under pressure. The handle lock barely caught the latch. Both locks looked secure, but did not actually hold the door closed. The realization settled slowly. The door had never been locked. I spent the rest of that day checking the space more carefully than before. I looked through the laundry area, behind the water heater, inside the storage cabinets. I checked the windows, the vents, the smoke detector. In the bedroom, one wall had a large metal air return vent near the floor. It was painted the same color as the wall and looked original. When I knelt down, I noticed the screws were newer than the others in the room. I removed them with a small screwdriver from my bag. Behind the vent was a shallow cavity. Inside it sat a small black device attached to the wood framing. It had a lens and a memory card slot. The lens pointed directly toward the bed. I did not touch anything else. I put the vent back loosely, packed a bag, and left the unit. I went straight to the hospital and contacted security, who helped me file a police report. Officers came to the property that afternoon. They removed the device and searched the basement and the upstairs portion of the house. They found additional cameras hidden in other short-term rental areas of the home. They also found a key that opened the exterior basement door from outside, even when the interior lock was engaged. The officers later confirmed that the host had been entering the unit while guests were away and sometimes while they were sleeping. He accessed the basement through the exterior door and the interior door when the latch did not hold. The pacing I heard that night matched the time he said he had been walking upstairs. The camera had been recording to a local memory card. The device was not connected to the internet, which meant the footage had to be collected in person. Police told me he had been doing this for several years with different guests. Travel nurses, short-term workers, people staying alone for a few weeks at a time. People who came and went on irregular schedules. I moved into a hotel that same day and completed the rest of my assignment there. The investigation continued after I left the city. Months later, I was notified that charges had been filed and that evidence from multiple victims had been recovered. What stayed with me was how ordinary the place had felt. Nothing dramatic, nothing obviously wrong. Just a quiet basement, a polite host, and small details that were easy to ignore when I was tired. The door had always looked locked. That was enough to make me believe I was alone. I landed in Tokyo in May 2017 with one backpack and no fixed plan beyond 2 weeks of moving through the city alone. I had saved for the trip for years. I wanted quiet mornings, narrow streets, convenience store dinners, and the feeling of being unknown in a place that never stops moving. I booked a small Airbnb in Setagaya because it was affordable and close to a train station. The photos showed a clean, white room with a low bed, a compact kitchen, and a narrow bathroom molded from plastic. It looked like most of the budget apartments I had seen online. The building stood on a side street behind a row of vending machines. It was 4 stories tall, gray concrete, no decoration. Bicycles were locked to a metal rack near the entrance. The hallway smelled faintly of detergent and something older underneath, like damp concrete. My unit was on the 3rd floor. The door opened directly into the room. The bed took up most of the space. There was a small folding table, a wall-mounted air conditioner, and a kitchenette with a single burner. Everything was tidy. The sheets were crisp. Towels were folded on the pillow. I felt relieved. Traveling alone always carries a small tension until the first night passes without trouble. The first day went smoothly. I walked for hours. I returned after dark with sore feet and a plastic bag of snacks. I showered and fell asleep fast. Nothing felt strange. The room was silent except for distant traffic and the hum of the refrigerator. On the second afternoon, I stayed inside longer. It rained. I was sitting on the bed looking at my phone when I noticed a small black dome fixed near the ceiling above the kitchenette. It was about the size of a golf ball, smooth, glossy, mounted on a short base. I had not paid attention to it before. It blended into the corner where the wall met the ceiling. I assumed it was a smoke detector or some sensor connected to the fire alarm system. I had seen similar shapes in offices. That night I turned off the lights and lay on my back staring up at the ceiling. The rain had stopped. The room was dark except for a thin line of streetlight leaking through the curtains. My eyes adjusted. That was when I saw a faint red point inside the dome. It was small, steady, not blinking. It sat in the center like an ember. I sat up and kept looking at it. I told myself it was part of a smoke detector. Some electronics have standby lights. Still, the placement felt wrong. Most detectors I had seen were white and flat, not glossy black domes. This one looked more like a security camera you would see in a store. I stood on the bed and leaned closer. The surface reflected my face in a distorted curve. I could see a darker circle inside, like a lens. My stomach tightened. I felt exposed in a way I had not felt before. I thought about the shower, about changing clothes, about sleeping. I replayed the last 2 days in my head. I checked the listing on my phone. There was no mention of cameras inside the unit. The host had described the place as private and secure. I searched online for hidden camera images. The device above me looked almost identical to indoor surveillance cameras sold for small shops. I did not panic. I took a piece of clear tape from my toiletry bag and pressed it over the center of the dome. I added more layers until the red light disappeared. I turned off the lights again and lay down. My heart was beating hard. I kept my eyes open. Less than 10 minutes later, my phone vibrated. A message from the host appeared on the screen. The text was short. It instructed me not to cover the device. There was no explanation, no apology, no context. Just that instruction. My chest felt tight. The timing left no doubt. The person had been watching the feed in real time. There was no other way they could know what I had done. I stared at the message for a long time. I did not respond. I did not remove the tape. Instead, I stood up and looked around the room again. I checked the bathroom ceiling, the air conditioner, the smoke detector near the door. I found no other obvious devices. That did not calm me. It made me wonder what I was missing. I unplugged the small router on the shelf near the table. The room went silent except for the refrigerator. I packed my clothes into my backpack with shaking hands. It was after midnight. The last trains were still running. I did not want to spend another minute inside that space. I opened the door quietly and stepped into the hallway. The building felt empty. The elevator was slow. I chose the stairs. Outside, the air felt cooler than before. I walked to the main road and stood under a streetlight. My phone screen looked too bright in the dark. I booked a business hotel near Shibuya Station for the remaining nights. It cost more than I planned, but I did not hesitate. I never went back to that apartment. I left the key in the mailbox slot and sent a short message stating that I had left due to an undisclosed surveillance device inside the unit. The host replied the next morning with a claim that the device was for security and was controlled by the building management. They insisted it was standard in that property. There was still no mention of it in the listing. After returning home, I reported the incident to the platform. I provided photos I had taken of the dome with and without the tape. Weeks later, I received a response stating that the account had been suspended pending investigation. I searched online and found forum posts from other travelers describing similar black domes in short-term rentals across Tokyo in that period. Some mentioned that building owners installed remote monitoring systems in multiple units, often without clear disclosure to guests. In certain cases, the devices were connected to centralized control panels in an office off-site. The red light indicated active streaming capability. I also learned that Japanese privacy laws require clear notification if surveillance equipment is present inside a private rental space. The responsibility falls on the property owner, and the host to inform guests in advance. Failure to do so can result in fines. That knowledge gave me some closure. What I saw was not my imagination. It was not a misunderstanding. It was an undisclosed camera in a space marketed as private. The experience changed how I travel. I now inspect ceilings, vents, and shelves the moment I enter any rental. I read listings with a different mindset. That apartment in Tokyo looked harmless in photographs. It was clean and small and ordinary. But the sense of safety I felt on the first night was false. I often think about how easily I could have ignored the red light. I could have assumed it was harmless and gone to sleep. The host might have continued watching without interruption. The message they sent confirmed the worst part, not just that the device existed, but that someone was actively monitoring it. That fact removed any doubt. There were no ghosts, no strange noises, no dramatic chase. The fear came from something simple and real. A small black dome near the ceiling. A red light in the dark. A message that arrived too fast. A reminder that privacy can disappear without warning if you do not question what you see. My name is Mark Delaney. In November 2014, I was driving alone across the Midwest on a loose plan that involved no fixed schedule and no reservations more than a day ahead. I had left Colorado that morning and intended to push east until I felt tired. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of old metal. The trees were bare. Cornfields stretched flat and empty on both sides of the highway. I decided to stop before dark and opened the Airbnb app on my phone at a gas station somewhere off a 2-lane road. I picked the first place that looked private and affordable. The listing said entire house. The photos showed a small ranch-style home with tan siding, a porch light, and a gravel driveway. No neighbors in sight. The host's name was listed as David. He messaged that he could meet me within the hour. The address led me down a narrow county road with no streetlights. It was already dark when I turned into the driveway. The house sat back from the road behind a stretch of patchy lawn. A detached garage stood off to the right. One light glowed above the front door. Nothing else moved. David stepped out before I had shut off my engine. He looked to be in his late 40s, average height, average build, wearing jeans and a flannel jacket. His hair was short and thinning. He shook my hand and took my overnight bag without asking. His grip was firm and dry. He walked ahead of me up the porch steps. Inside, the house smelled faintly of bleach and something stale underneath it. The living room held a brown couch, a recliner, a glass coffee table, and a television mounted too high on the wall. The kitchen was small and clean, with dishes drying on a rack. A narrow hallway led to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. He showed me each room in turn. The master bedroom held a queen bed with gray sheets pulled tight. The second bedroom was set up as an office with a desk and a bookshelf filled with old paperbacks. The bathroom was spotless, towels folded on the sink. Everything matched the photos. Nothing seemed staged. It felt lived in. At the end of the tour, he gestured toward the back door and pointed out the detached garage through the window. He indicated that he would be staying out there for the night in case I needed anything. The listing had not mentioned that. I assumed he meant he would sleep there and give me space. I told myself it was a rural property, and maybe he did not want to leave a stranger alone in his house without being nearby. He left through the back door. I heard it close. I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. I locked both the front and back doors. I checked the windows. Most were latched. The bedroom window opened easily, so I pushed it down hard and tested it twice. I placed my bag on the bed and sat for a minute, listening. The house settled with small creaks that come with cold weather. The heater clicked on and pushed out dry air that smelled dusty. I made a simple dinner from food I had bought earlier and watched television for an hour. My body felt heavy from driving. Around 11, I turned off the lights in the living room and went to the bedroom. I locked the bedroom door, even though it felt unnecessary. I brushed my teeth, turned off the bathroom light, and lay down. The house was silent at first. No traffic. No wind strong enough to rattle anything. I closed my eyes. At some point after midnight, I woke to a sound that did not belong to the house settling. It was the soft thud of a footstep on carpet. Then another, slow and measured, coming from the hallway. I lay still. My first thought was that I had imagined it. Then I heard the faint click of the bathroom light switch. A thin line of light appeared under the bedroom door. It stayed on for several seconds. I could hear nothing else. No running water. No movement. The light clicked off. Darkness returned. My heart was pounding hard enough that I felt it in my throat. I told myself he might have come inside to use the bathroom. Maybe the garage had no plumbing. Maybe this was normal for him. Another step sounded outside the bedroom door. It stopped close to it. I stared at the handle, waiting to see it turn. It did not move. After a long pause, the footsteps retreated down the hallway. I heard the back door open and close again. I did not sleep after that. I kept the lamp on and sat upright against the headboard, listening for more movement. None came. The heater cycled on and off. Around 6 the sky began to lighten through the blinds. When I finally unlocked the bedroom door and stepped into the hallway, the air felt different. The bathroom door was slightly open. The sink was dry. The mirror showed no streaks from steam. The light was off. I walked to the front of the house. By the door, on the small mat where I had wiped my boots the night before, sat a pair of men's shoes. Brown work shoes with worn heels. They had not been there when I arrived. I remembered clearly because I had set my own shoes near the wall, and the space by the door had been empty. I checked the back door. It was unlocked. A tight feeling formed in my chest. I stepped outside and walked toward the detached garage. The door was shut. No car inside. No bedding visible through the small window. I returned to the house and found him in the kitchen, standing by the counter as if he had always been there. He looked calm. There was no sign of embarrassment. He did not appear tired. He admitted that he had come inside during the night. He said he preferred to stay in the house in case guests needed anything. He said he slept on the couch sometimes. He framed it as a convenience. The listing had promised an entire house. What I had was a shared space with a man who moved through the hallway after midnight without notice. The idea that he had been inside while I slept made my skin feel tight. I packed my bag without rushing. I checked every room before leaving, opening the office closet and looking behind the shower curtain. Nothing else was out of place. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was damaged. At the front door, I saw that his shoes were gone. I left the key on the kitchen counter and walked out without looking back. The gravel crunched under my boots as I reached my car. I locked the doors immediately after getting in. On the drive away, the house grew smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared behind the curve of the road. I pulled over a few miles later and contacted Airbnb support. I described what had happened in detail. They refunded the night and opened an investigation. Months later, I checked the platform out of curiosity. The listing was gone. I still think about that hallway and the thin strip of light under the door. There was no ghost, no intruder, no hidden tunnel. There was a man who ignored boundaries and a guest who trusted a description on a screen. I finished the road trip without another incident, but I never again booked a place that did not guarantee the host would be off-site. The memory remains clear because it was simple. A house that was not empty. Footsteps that had a reason. A door that had been unlocked from the inside. I went to London in March 2022 for a 5-day training course my company required. It was held near Holborn, early mornings to late afternoons, and the firm covered my accommodation. Hotels in that area were expensive, so I booked a small Airbnb flat in a converted townhouse in Bloomsbury. The listing showed a bright studio with a kitchenette, a narrow bed, a desk, and tall windows facing the street. It looked quiet and practical. I was traveling alone and planned to spend most of my time at the training center, so I chose convenience over anything else. Check-in was self-service. A lockbox held the keys. The building was old but well kept, with worn stone steps and a faint smell of polish and dust. The flat was on the second floor. Inside, everything matched the photos. Clean sheets, folded towels, labeled kitchen jars, a printed welcome sheet on the desk. The heating worked. The street outside had light traffic and steady pedestrian noise that faded after dark. The only thing that stood out was a narrow closet near the bathroom. It was painted the same white as the walls. A printed label was taped at eye level. It read owner's storage. The handle had a small keyhole. I tried the handle out of habit. It did not move. I unpacked, showered, and reviewed my training materials. By the time I went to bed, it was close to midnight. The first night, I woke around 3 in the morning to a faint vibration sound. It took a moment to place it. It was the sound of a phone on a hard surface, buzzing repeatedly. Short bursts, then silence, then another burst. It seemed to come from the hallway area near the closet. I sat up and listened. The sound stopped. The building was quiet. Old buildings carry noise in strange ways, so I assumed it came from another flat, maybe through the walls or floor. I went back to sleep. The second night was longer and more tiring. After dinner, I returned to the flat and went through notes for several hours. Around 11, while I was brushing my teeth, I heard something low and steady from the hallway. Not a clear voice, more like the sound of someone speaking softly behind a wall. The tone rose and fell, but I could not make out words. I turned off the bathroom fan and stood still. The sound faded. When I stepped back into the main room, I thought I heard a brief murmur again, then nothing. The walls in the building were thin. The flats were stacked closely. I assumed someone nearby was on a late call. Still, I noticed that the sound seemed to come from the direction of the closet. Before bed, I passed it and looked at the handle. The label was still there. The door looked normal. I tried the handle again. It did not open. The next morning I left early and stayed out until evening. The training was intense, and I was tired when I returned. I heated a ready meal, answered work emails, and then started packing some things for the next day. While I was folding clothes on the bed, I heard the vibration again. Clear this time. Short bursts, then silence, then another burst. It was definitely coming from the closet area. I walked over and stood in front of the door. The vibration came once more, faint but distinct. I put my hand on the handle and turned it. It opened. The door moved inward a few inches, then stopped against something soft. A warm smell came out, like heated fabric and stale air. I pushed gently. Inside was a narrow space, deeper than I expected. A thin mattress lay along the floor, pressed against the back wall. A portable electric heater stood beside it, plugged into a power strip. The strip ran to an outlet near the door. There were food wrappers, empty bottles, a folded blanket, and a small plastic bag with toiletries. Near the pillow, a phone lay face down. It vibrated once more while I was standing there. I stepped back and closed the door slowly. For a few seconds, I did nothing. Then I checked the lock. There was no key inside. The latch worked from the outside, but the door had never actually been locked. The air in the flat felt different after that. I noticed small things I had ignored. The heater plug ran across the baseboard in a way that had been painted over. The outlet near the closet looked newer than the others. The welcome sheet never mentioned the storage area being occupied or serviced. I checked the listing on my phone. Nothing about shared space. Entire flat. No host access during stay. I did not want to open the door again. Instead, I unplugged the heater from the outlet and placed the plug on the kitchen counter. Then I put a chair under the closet handle so it could not open easily from inside. I slept with the main room lights on. The next day at training, I contacted the host through the app. I described what I found and asked for an explanation. Several hours passed with no response. When I returned to the flat that evening, the chair was still under the handle. The heater plug remained on the counter. The closet door was closed. I did not open it. Around 9 that night, I heard the front door of the building open and close below. Footsteps came up the stairs. That was normal. The building had several flats. The steps continued past my door, then stopped outside it. There was a pause. The handle moved slightly. The chair held it in place. The door did not open. The handle moved again, harder this time. Then a soft knock. Not loud. Measured. The handle turned once more, pushing against the chair. I did not move. I stood near the window with my phone in my hand. After about a minute, the pressure stopped. I heard footsteps moving down the stairs quickly. The building door opened and closed again. I called the non-emergency police line and reported an unauthorized entry attempt. Officers arrived within 20 minutes. I explained everything and showed them the closet. They opened it fully. The mattress was warm. The phone was gone. The host contacted me later that night through the app. The message was brief and formal. It said her adult son had been staying there temporarily without her knowledge. He had lost his job during the pandemic and had been using the space to avoid paying rent elsewhere. She claimed she believed he had already moved out. She apologized and offered a partial refund. The police spoke with him the next day. He admitted he still had a key to the building and had been returning at night while guests were out or asleep. He charged his phone and used the heater, then left early in the morning. He had assumed no one would check the closet. I moved to a hotel for the remaining 2 nights. The company covered the change after I explained the situation. When I left London, The case was still under review for unlawful entry and violation of rental terms. The host's listing was removed from the platform within a week. Since then, whenever I stay anywhere alone, I check every door the moment I arrive. I do not rely on labels or assumptions. Locked does not always mean empty.